We've made it. It's Friday, October 17th. Lots going on always. But there was an important case that I wanted to bring to your attention. It probably escaped your notice because, candidly, how can we be on top of everything that is happening? But it really is such a heartbreaking case. And I wanted to share it with you because it just underscores and highlights the injustice that is the Trump administration when it comes to this absurd immigration enforcement process that is happening right now. It involves an Indian man. His name is Subramanyam. Subu is his nickname, so we'll call him Subu Vedam. And on October 3rd of 2025, Subu walked out of the Huntingdon State Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania, a state prison. He had spent more than 40 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 64 years old is his age now. And this is a man who came to the United States from India when he was only 9 months old. You can imagine for more than 4 decades, Subu, with the help of loved ones, some family, and supporters, has been fighting to prove that he's innocent. And that despite having been found guilty by a jury, there was evidence that was suppressed by the prosecution. And after that evidence came to light, after the Innocence Project became involved, after a decent judge says, we can't do this anymore, Subu was released. And as he stood on the steps of that institution, that correctional facility, thinking, oh my God, I have fought so hard for this day, he was immediately taken into custody by what? By the federal government, by DHS, to be deported back to a country that he hasn't lived in or been to really in more than 4 decades, a country that really doesn't have any family in and doesn't have any connection to anymore. But according to the Trump administration, that's where he deserves to go. So let's get into the details of Subu's case. Again, maybe an outlier for what we usually are hearing about when it comes to these deportations, but just seemed so wildly, outrageously offensive that I wanted to share it with you. So as I said, Subu was released after more than 4 decades of being wrongfully imprisoned, and we're going to get into the details of his case. So in late 1980, a 19-year-old boy was reported missing, and 9 months later, in September of 1981, his body was found. His remains were found with a bullet wound in his skull. Subu arrived from India with his parents in 1962 at 9 months of age. He has been a permanent resident of the United States since he arrived from India, and he was raised with a deep respect for India and his heritage. Now, according to all people that grew up with him and knew him from his early ages as he was raised by his family here in the United States, he was known for being peaceful, calm, nice, friendly, no incidents of drama. He enrolled in Penn State University at the age of 20 to work as a lab technician. On the day that Tom Kinzer disappeared in December of 1980, Subu had called him to seek a ride to a nearby town. Tom agreed, went to pick up Subu. Later that day, Tom's van was found returned to its usual parking space at his apartment, but no one witnessed the return of this van. In March of 82, Subu was arrested and held on 19 charges unrelated to Tom Kinzer's death. Never notified that as an Indian citizen, he was allowed to contact the consulate for assistance. His parents were on a sabbatical in Germany, and when they came back to post his bond, Subu was charged that day with first-degree murder, and so there was no option of bail. All other charges were dropped. Imprisoned without bail for nearly a year, labeled a foreigner likely to flee despite having been in the United States since age 9 months, and his passport already having been confiscated as well as his green card, Subu sat in jail. Sound familiar? That happens to a lot, sadly, of Americans that are here in the United States. Prior to his first trial, there was extensive prejudicial pretrial publicity. He had 2 trials, let me be clear. Before and during both of those trials, the trial judge repeatedly denied motions for discovery, expert witnesses, and a change of venue, despite the pretrial prejudicial publicity concerning his case. The prosecution indicated it would seek the death penalty for Subu, and during the jury selection process, no students and others from the university community were considered, despite those being peers of Subu. The first trial held in February of 1983. During that, the prosecution had no eyewitnesses and no direct evidence, no gun, no exact date of death, no credible motive, no evidence of any animosity between Tom and Subu. A local teenager had testified that he had sold Subu an antique handgun, but that antique handgun could not have been the handgun used in the murder of Tom Kinzer. No other investigations or evidence was presented by the prosecution suggesting that other possible suspects had been investigated or pursued. The all-white jury of people older than 40 convicted Subu and sentenced him to life without parole. After a successful appeal of his conviction on the basis of things like insufficient evidence, lack of change of venue, jury selection deficiencies, etc., the Pennsylvania State Superior Court and State Supreme Court overturned his conviction, citing those trial irregularities, and so they remanded the case back for a second trial. In February of 1988, so now Subu has been in custody for at least 6 years, the case was sent back to the same exact trial court judge and the same exact prosecutor for a retrial. And despite the issue concerning adverse and prejudicial pretrial publicity, the change of venue was denied. The jury selected for Subu's second trial was again local, white, and middle-aged. Not a jury of his peers, right? Evidence presented about the body, the bullets, the casings, etc., right? That was presented. But the prosecution, right, was then now presenting facts about drug use among teenagers, but no motive, no credible motive was presented to the jury. Of note, the gun that prosecutors said was the murder weapon never produced, nor was any evidence connecting that gun to the crime charged. 40 years later, in 2022, documents surfaced that showed that prosecutors concealed, they hid an FBI ballistics report that showed that the gun that the prosecutor said was the murder weapon that they were trying to link to Subu, it could never have fired the shot that would have killed the victim, Tom Kinzer. 40 years later, only after Subu had the assistance of the Innocence Project and the support of supporters and friends and people who cared, who knew that he was innocent, was this evidence revealed that had been concealed by the prosecution. An FBI ballistics report that showed that the murder weapon that the prosecution said was linked to Subu, that it could never have fired the bullet that would have killed Tom Kinzer, the victim. For the first time during the trial, the defense put Subu on the stand to testify in that second trial. He was questioned for at least 3 hours, asked about really irrelevant questions about recreational drugs, questions about his citizenship, his trips to India, in other words, trying to demonize him for being an immigrant. Subu explained his trips were to visit family when he was young, ages 5 to 15 years, and that he meditated because it was a part of his upbringing as a Hindu. And in the end, despite objections by the defense, this entire exchange never appeared in the transcript, the official transcript of the trial. During the course of its initial investigation, the police department actually recorded interviews with various individuals, including others that were potentially suspects in this murder. Neither the transcript of the recordings nor the recordings themselves were ever provided to Subu's defense team at the time of the trials or during his subsequent appeals. These suppressed recordings and transcripts revealed ultimately a pattern of law enforcement investigators feeding information to witnesses instead of asking them to just answer the questions directly. In other words, it was a hammer in search of a nail from the very beginning, and the nail they immediately found was Subu Vedam. The jury in that second trial convicted Subu and sentenced him to life in prison without parole, But following that trial, some of the jurors said that they didn't think that they had heard the entire story. Now, I told you that eventually that evidence was revealed that had been concealed by the prosecution. And because his conviction was based mainly on circumstantial evidence, and once this information came out, fast forwarding more than 40 years later, right? In August of 2025, Judge Jonathan Grine of the Centre County Court of Common Pleas in Pennsylvania ruled that that concealed evidence that had been suppressed and hidden for more than 40 years represented a constitutional violation of due process for Subu. So a month later, the district attorney, Bernie Cantorna, dismissed the murder charge, saying that the retrial of Subu would be both impossible at this time and unjust. By then, by September of 2025, Subu Vedam had been the longest serving exoneree in Pennsylvania history and one of the longest in the history of the United States. So, thinking he is now free after having been wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for more than 40 years, ICE steps up and says, hey, we have a legacy deportation order tied to a drug conviction for when he was 19 years old for intent to distribute LSD. At 19, Vedam was convicted because he pleaded guilty at age 19 to intent to distribute LSD back in the 80s, right? So despite that, and having been eligible for deportation because he was serving a life sentence, they never executed the deportation order, right? So now though, now that he has been exonerated after being wrongfully convicted, now ICE says, you know what? We want to actually execute on this decades-old deportation order, so we want to kick you out of the country. They have defined Subu as a career criminal with a rap sheet dating back to 1980, which is bullshit because the only thing he has is that one conviction from when he was 19. His entire family and all of his family relationships are in the United States and in Canada. He has no connection to India anymore. And I want you to understand and listen to what his family members have said. His niece, Zoe, says that Subu is a deeply compassionate man who transformed his decades of imprisonment into a mission of service. He worked as a teacher, helping many, many people get their degrees. He completed multiple degrees himself. In India, in many ways, is a completely different world to him. He left India when he was 9 months old. He hasn't been there for over 44 years. His entire family, his sister, nieces, and grandnieces, all U.S. citizens and live here in the U.S. Zoe says his wrongful conviction has robbed him of the chance to build a normal life and has left him unprepared for exile in a country he doesn't know. Subu, he's never been able to work outside the prison system. He's never seen a modern film. He's never been on the internet. He doesn't know technology. To send him to India at 64 on his own and away from his family and community would just be extending the harm of his wrongful incarceration. Subu's legal team has filed a motion to reopen his immigration case and a petition for stay of deportation while that motion is pending. They basically said, look, he's been a model inmate. He's led literacy programs, raised funds for big brothers and big sisters, and tutored hundreds of fellow prisoners when he was working towards a high school diploma. The first person in 150 years at that correctional facility in Pennsylvania, Subu got a master's degree, completing his coursework by way of correspondence with a 4.0 GPA. But what his immigration team says this: Subu could never be formally naturalized because his earlier conviction technically made him deportable, but his wrongful murder conviction, having him put in custody immediately, led it to being impossible for him to pursue any relief in the immigration system. So again, it's just the compounding upon the compounding of injustice for this man. As I said at the beginning of this video, his case is like several others, and yet I just feel like in some ways it's worse. To have to be wrongfully convicted for a crime you never committed, to have to serve more than 40 years in prison for a crime you never committed is horrific, right? The man has had his youth and his life pretty much stolen from him. And now to end insult to injury, Trump's administration wants to deport him to a country that he hasn't been in since he's been, 9 months old? That he's lived in since he's been 9 months old. These are the kinds of cases that I want to highlight because they may sound like they're outliers or just random things, but they're not. There are so many people that are being rounded up, scooped off our streets that may or may not have had prior contact with our judicial system. but more importantly, that have built lives here in the United States and with no pathway, with no amnesty, with no way to be able to achieve legal status here. Sometimes they live in shadows. Sometimes they just live in normal lives, but under the radar. We have to understand that our immigration system has been broken prior to this administration, if we are being frank. But this is not the solution, the way that Trump has gone about trying to fix our immigration system. He has decided that fixing the immigration system isn't a worthwhile effort. In his mind, we're just going to round up people that don't look white and don't look like him and his followers and his supporters, and we're just going to ship them off to third party countries or to, just horrible facilities in El Salvador. We're not going to actually do something to make this country better. We're actually going to make it worse by eliminating people that create an incredibly diverse fabric that makes this country worthwhile being in and makes it not white Christian nationalist. I wanted to bring Subu Vedam's case to you. I wanted you to hear about it. You're welcome to explore it more in detail. But I'd like to know from you in the comments your thoughts. Do you think it's just what is happening to him? That he is being, there's an active pursuit to deport him after having been wrongfully convicted and having been imprisoned for more than 40 years? Is it wrong to want to deport somebody who committed a crime when they were 19, pled guilty, did their time, and since then didn't do anything wrong? I really want to know. And so let me know, and I'll see you on the other side. Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.